Join the only roundtable podcast in compliance with 5 of the top commentators in compliance. Mike Volkov brings 35 years of legal experience. Matt Kelly is the founder and editor of Radical Compliance. Jay Rosen is Mr. Monitor who knows his way around the culture of compliance. And Jonathan Armstrong, a partner at Cordery Compliance in London, rounds out this top group of compliance practitioners. Check out the rants and shout out at the end of each episode. Hosted by Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This episode is dedicated to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We have the full quintet of commentators this week: Jay Rosen, Jonathan Armstrong, Mike Volkov, Jonathan Marks, and Matt Kelly, and each gives their reflections on where they were at 9/11, what it meant for them, and what it means some 20 years later. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to this episode of Everything Compliance. We have the full quintet this week: Mike Volkov, Jay Rosen, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Marks, and Jonathan Armstrong. This podcast is being recorded on September 3rd. It's going to release on September 9th, and we're going to take the entire episode to get the Everything Compliance gang's reflections on 9/11. This year is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, so I've asked everyone to maybe speak on that topic. So, Mike Volkov, if I could maybe start with you, where were you on 9/11? Could you give us some of your reflections of that day and what it meant for you in the legal profession going forward?
Let's see. On that somber day, I was in Orlando, Walt Disney World, doing training for gang prosecutions with federal law enforcement agents. And somebody at around 9:30, I think, came in and said, "You guys got to all come out here. Everybody come out here." And we went out, and the first plane had already hit. And we just continued to watch TV as the second plane, I guess, came in, and then the towers crumbled. And I remember we were at Walt Disney World, and I recall that they shut down Disney World right away because there was a fear that it was a target for a terrorist attack, through the airplanes, because obviously there are a lot of people at the resort. So cell phones went dead, airplanes, obviously airports were shut down, and for days we just sort of hung out together at Disney World and, with law enforcement agents that I knew. And then ultimately I had to drive. Luckily I had rent a car, and I had to drive all the way back up to Washington, D.C. But there are a couple stories that always stick with me from that day. Not my own experience, but there were a couple that occurred that I remember. There's a really somber but moving documentary about 9/11, and focusing on some of the people who jumped at the end from the top of the building, or people who dove. And I always recall they closed the program with the fact 2 strangers were on top of the building and decided to hold hands while they jumped to their death. They didn't know each other, but yet they decided to hold hands. And it was that image that I'm always struck with, and always will be struck with regard to 9/11. So 20 years, it's amazing to think it's been 20 years. The impact on federal prosecutors was absolutely immediate. The priority of every office throughout all the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Justice Department turned immediately to, obviously, terrorism, immigration issues in terms of, because there had been immigration violations that occurred. And it changed the entire dynamic of the Justice Department. I had never seen sort of such an impact in my career. And all of a sudden, resources were reallocated. Old cases were dusted off. Investigations were started or reinitiated, and sort of a massive effort was made. So it had besides the personal impact, as well as, to your families and to people that you may have known who were lost in the towers. It was obviously, something that we will live with just in the same way that we live with, the assassination of JFK. Like, where were you when the assassination occurred? And there, I was only 6 years old, but this was obviously more dramatic. It's a somber day, and I think obviously going through what we went through in Afghanistan in 20 years and just the recent withdrawal, it still sticks with us, obviously, the impact of it. So that's sort of my reflection on a difficult time.
So, Mike, looking back from today and the past 20 years, we've been at war, and now with the fall of Kabul, really anything that strikes you as when you've reflected back on this important anniversary, or is it just really the enormity of what we all experienced on 9/11?
No, there's obviously, I was struck by the fact that there were people that were killed recently in Kabul in with the bombing. Some of them weren't even, as I recall, were either just born or just around the time of 9/11. And here they were serving in Afghanistan and killed in the line of duty. That just struck me as, it was actually kind of an eye-opening moment to think it was 20 years ago when these young soldiers were killed. So that hit me in terms of, the dedication and the commitment that people in the military had, and the fact that they weren't even present or were, infants or young people at the time that 9/11 occurred. So to me, there was something about that just stuck with me.
Jay Rosen, could you tell us where you were on 9/11 and the profession you were in, and how 9/11 may have changed that? And then maybe looking back 20 years later, what are some of your thoughts as you thought back about not only that day, but what it's meant for America over the last 20 years?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So 20 years ago, I was living in Palms, California, which is a little part of Los Angeles, and it's basically between two famous studios. To the north of me was 20th Century Fox, where I had worked from 92 to 96. And to the south of me was the old MGM lot, which at the time was owned by Sony. And I was doing one of my many pivots that people have heard about, and I was finishing 13 years in the entertainment business. And I just wrapped up working on a movie called The Perfect Storm. And I was assisting a colleague of mine who I knew from Fox, who was an author, and she was publishing a book and getting ready to take a trip. And I remember the phone ringing, and it just kept ringing. It was very early in the morning here in Los Angeles, I guess 5:30 or so. And then I finally picked up, and my girlfriend was on the other line, and she said, "You need to turn on the TV right now." And just like Mike was saying, the first plane had hit and the second plane was coming. After that, I was in kind of a daze and didn't know what to do. So I went to my friend's office, and she was supposed to be taking a business trip to Calgary. So I don't know what possessed us, but for some reason, she thought she still might be able to take off. So we were trying to investigate, and the airports were closed. But the next day, she wanted to take this trip to Vancouver. So I remember taking her to the airport at LAX, and they wouldn't even let you in to the airport. They have these overflow parking lots with shuttle buses, and I was able to drop her off there. And then I just remember thinking back, like, why would she think it was so important that she had to go to Vancouver? You know, we just had this tragedy. Why would anybody want to get back in the air? But I don't know if it's people in LA or the entertainment business, but there was another couple hundred folks out in this lot trying to take a bus in and to get to the airport. And I think she may have gotten out, but it might have taken 10 to 12 hours to do so. And I think before this tragedy, people were very self-centered, and there were things that they wanted to do because they were important and they needed to go. And I just think that our whole life for the last 20 years has just been turned upside down. And, you couldn't take your nail clippers onto the airplane. You couldn't take in any deodorant that was more than 3.5 ounces. And a lot of these things seemed very arbitrary, and we all felt that we were very put upon. But I think as the years have gone by, we adapt, and we don't pick people up at the gate anymore at the airport. You pick them up at baggage claim. So there are just certain things you need to do. And recently, I've started thinking about this again with the pandemic, that I took a first business trip 2 weeks ago to Texas. And it'd been such a long time ago, I kept pestering the travel agent, and I said, well, how are they going to know my TSA, and how are they going to know that I've got a boarding pass? And they're like, Mr. Rosen, treating me like I was a grandfather. What happens is when you log in for your flight, you're going to get a boarding pass, and you're going to get your TSA approval. And I said, thank you. So it's just funny how you can just be, your life can change. And even in that blink of an eye, everything that you thought that you were important, that was all about us, it wasn't about us. It was about this country and pulling ourselves together. And I think we're going to do rants and raves later, but like when Simon and Garfunkel ask, where did you go, Joe DiMaggio? I want to ask, where did you go, Rudy Giuliani? Where did you go from Mr. Mayor, the man who united us and asked us to all come together as people? And 20 years later now, we're divisive, we're very tribal. And I just think a lot of the things that brought this country together, even though it was during a time of tragedy, I hope people will think about that now, 20 years later, that we were all together. We all had a common goal. And, I don't see any reason why we can't be that way today. So in terms of the changes in professional life, and we had to make sacrifices. We had to be able to put planes back in the sky, and we had to continue on in a business sense. So I think that we are highly adaptable. There's a lot of things that we do different in business now that we didn't do before. So that day was horrible, but quickly people started to look outwards, and it wasn't about how this is affecting me, Jay Rosen, but it's like how this is affecting us as a country, and how do we come together, and how do we continue to live a life, because we're not going to let terrorism keep us immobilized and stuck in our homes and stuck in our offices. So a little rambling, but those are those initial thoughts and feelings that I had when the phone kept ringing early on that morning of September 11th.
Jonathan Marks, could you tell us where you were on 9/11, what you were feeling that day? What changed, if anything, in your profession because of 9/11? And now, 20 years later, looking back, what are some of your reminiscences of not only that day, but the changes that it wrought for America?
Sure. I'll roll back a little bit first, though, because Tuesday, 9/11, I'll get to in a moment. But on 9/10, I actually had a lunch meeting at Windows of the World in the World Trade Center, which meeting was supposed to take place on 9/11. So the Friday before 9/11, I get a phone call saying the meeting that was supposed to take place on Tuesday was moved to Monday. And I remember thinking to myself, I got to commute to New York on a Monday to go to this meeting, blah, 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 blah. Well, long story short that's probably the best change in calendar I ever had. But where was I on 9/11 was actually even more interesting. So I don't live too far from the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. And right outside the Willow Grove Naval Air Station, there's a little barber shop. And I've been getting my hair cut there since I was a kid. and the barbershop opens early, so the military men can, get their high and tight and roll onto the base without issue. So I roll in about 7:45, and the place is packed. There's probably like 20 or 30 servicemen there. And at the time, they were the A-10 Warthog were stationed at Willow Grove. So a lot of the guys were pilots that were sitting in the barbershop. And I remember, there were two barbers, Gregory and Carl, and I was probably number 25. And then you can imagine the old time barbershop, which it was. It wasn't very fancy. And up on the top shelf along the back there was a TV, a small TV with TV antenna, with a TV antenna plugged in, and everyone was watching the news. And I remember talking to one of the servicemen to the right of me and to the left of me, and we were just kind of talking about life. And, like every barbershop, back then they had magazines, so people were reading magazines and making fun of things. And I remember it was like literally, I guess it was around 8:40, 8:45, 8:50. And all of a sudden, about 5 minutes later, the news came on, and there was a report that a small plane had hit one of the towers. And they immediately flashed there and saw the smoke coming out of the side of the World Trade Center. And, everybody's watching this, and they're watching the report and so on and so forth. And couldn't have been more than, I guess, 20 minutes later, if my memory serves me correctly, where the second plane wind up hitting the towers. Now, all of a sudden, I watch all these men that are sitting in the barbershop. Literally, if you all remember the Exit Stage Right, cartoon, every single one of them ran out of there on foot and didn't get into their cars, ran through the gates of the base and disappeared. And I'm like, what the heck's going on? And I remember one of the guys saying, go get your family and go home. So I didn't get my hair cut. I got in my car. I remember calling my wife, and my kids were at nursery school at the time. I'm like, get the kids, go pick them up. I don't care where they are, and bring them home. And we did. And we went and got the kids. We picked them up and we brought them home. And we're sitting in the living room where I'm sitting right now, talking to you, and I'm watching television, and I'm watching this sad event unfold and thinking about all of my family and friends that are in New York City, my brother-in-law, my dear friend that I grew up with, the people that I knew that worked at Cantor Fitzgerald. I actually lost a friend who worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. May rest in peace. And, just wondering, what the heck's going on. And then, getting phone calls later from my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, and people as they walked over the bridges to get out of the city. And my sister-in-law, who lived in Battery Park, just on the perimeter of where all the terrorism took place, I remember her saying, she needs to get out of there. So, I remember running to the store, believe it or not, and getting N95 and respirators and things like that for all of us the following day to go in there to basically peel her out of her apartment. And I remember seeing all the stuff in New York City, the aftermath of all of this, and everything smoldering, and the soot and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. It truly was. And at that moment in time, there's a lot that changed. If somebody cut you off, they didn't give you the finger. If somebody butt in line, they said, excuse me. Everyone all of a sudden became nice to one another. Sadly, that's dissipated over the last 20 years. But for, several months afterwards, it seemed like the world was, mourning for the people that lost their lives and the first responders and, everybody else that played a part at 9/11. But, everyone seemed to be nicer to one another. I don't know where that went. And, I hope someday we all get it back. But I also remember, because I traveled a lot, looking up in the sky for the first time and not seeing contrails or hearing planes or, like nobody was traveling, and, hearing stories and all that kind of good stuff. But, it was just, it was a pretty memorable moment for me and my family. And like I said, my children were young, but, I remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember those servicemen running out of that barbershop like it was nobody's business. And I don't know where they went or what happened, or but definitely a somber day for me. How it affected me professionally. Nobody really knew what happened at the time. I mean, we knew that there was a terrorist attack, but the machinations on how it all came together and how the plot was planned, and who did what, where, when, why, and how. I mean, that was all coming to light. And so, you start to read, and, I remember reading the 9/11 Commission report, which actually, believe it or not, just recently read again. I actually just testified in a 9/11 money laundering and terrorist financing case, believe it or not. And so it kind of brought back all those memories. But for me professionally, some of the things that, I keep thinking about, the way it impacted me was, the movement of money around the globe is a very, very interesting thing. And the way that, these terrorists finance these operations. And, one would think that, there was a gazillion dollars that was transferred all over the place. I don't necessarily believe that to be true. But, a lot of people were falsely accused, during the events of 9/11. And a lot of people haven't really been, in my opinion, haven't really been prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law yet. But for what I do from an investigatory side, we do follow the money. We do work with, we do look at money laundering, and we do look at terrorist financing every now and again. And, it really changed me. It made me a little bit angry, like literally wanting to dig more and figure out, kind of what's going on here. Is this really, are the allegations true, or are they not true? And so, that's how it impacted me, personally. I also remember one other data point. I was at a baseball game with my kids, and I'll never forget, the screen flashed, and all of a sudden they told us that OBL had been taken down. So I remember 42,000 fans standing up and cheering again, sort of that level of connectivity amongst Americans. Maybe it was some form of relief for some, but for me, it was just part of the overall sadness of the day of 9/11.
So, Jonathan, looking back now, some 20 years later, do you see, or I guess, what are your reminiscences? I know your boys were quite young. I don't know if your daughter was born yet, but kind of having seen them grow up in the post 9/11 world, what are you feeling this week as we come up on this 20th anniversary?
I don't think they look at the world the same. I think there's some level of caution in the things that we all do. Jay was talking about, once being received at, the gate of an airport. We don't do that anymore for security reasons. I definitely think that I don't know that they really understood on that day, but I think as they went through school and they learned about the events of that day, I do think they're a little bit more cautious about certain things. I know it's affected me. I have a very sad but funny story. I was on a flight probably about 4 years ago, and a gentleman took out his laptop and turned it over, and he put it on the tray table on the plane. Then he took out a screwdriver and he undid the bottom. And the woman to the seat to the right of me is looking at me, and I'm looking at her, and I have no idea what's going on. And the gentleman that was doing this was of Middle Eastern descent, or at least he appeared to be. And we had no idea what was going on. The plane started taxiing. The flight attendant said, make sure you pick your tray tables up. And he was still fiddling around with this computer. Meantime, I grabbed a pen, and I'm looking at her, and she's looking at me. And the thing that's running through my mind, I'm sure the audience really doesn't want to know, but I was literally ready to take this guy out in one fell swoop. And I finally said to the guy, I said, what the heck are you doing? And he goes, he turned to me and he laughed, and he said, my damn hard drive, when I travel in my backpack, it shakes out. So I have to take it out and reseat it in order for me to use my laptop. But I looked at him and I said, but I said, I don't know you from Adam. I said, I am so sorry. But I said, I literally had bad thoughts running through my head. And he looked at me and goes, I can understand why why you would think that way. And to me, that was it was a sad day for me. Again, another sad moment for me because, immediately I'm thinking sort of the worst. And all this guy was trying to do was to fix his laptop so he could watch a movie on the flight. I think it's changed all of us. I really do. And if it hasn't and you're numb to it, I mean, I know some people don't believe, or they're conspiracy theorists that believe that 9/11 didn't happen. I was there. I saw it. I mean, and anyone that's from New York or was there at that time, I mean, it happened.
And now a quick message from our sponsor. So, Matt Kelly, you've been in business journalism a long time, and I see you as a chronicler, and you've chronicled lots of stories and industries. I was really intrigued to maybe ask you where you were on 9/11 and how 9/11 affected your profession, and then maybe looking back as this chronicler, what your reminiscences might be 20 years later.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because I was thinking about how my profession is not quite like everybody else who's typically on the podcast here. And so back then, I was not necessarily just in business journalism. I was a freelance reporter for anybody who would pay me. And that specific morning at 8:46 a.m., my then girlfriend, she and I were living at the time together. She had gone to work. And I was a freelancer, so I was home by myself, and I was getting ready to do some laundry. And I did not have my TV on, but I did have the radio on. I think it was the NPR station here in Boston. And they mentioned a small plane has crashed into one tower. I go, well, okay, that's terrible. But as news things go, I'm assuming it's a little prop single craft thing, or a few people might have killed or been killed. And then at 9 o'clock, I hear a second plane has hit the other tower. And it's like, okay, that's really weird. That's strange. I go and I turn on the TV in the next room, and then I see the video, and it's real, okay, this is like a terrorist thing. This has to be. Shortly thereafter, around 9:30 in the morning, I got a call from a friend of mine who was a reporter at the New York Daily News in New York. And he called me up and said, look, these planes flew out of Boston. We need somebody to go to Logan Airport. You can do it. Can you go? Sure. And I mean, I was more than happy to get the work. And breaking news is something I had done for many years in my career at that point. And I talked to the editor, and they were so frantic down there that basically the editor said, have you worked at newspapers before? I said, yeah. Derek vouches for you. You're good? I said, yeah. He says, okay, you're hired. Go. And that was the whole interview process. It took 1 or 2 minutes. It sounded like there was chaos in the background there. I can only imagine what their newsroom would have been like at that time. And I went down into downtown Boston. I was living 1 or 2 cities out. And by the time I got to downtown, they had already closed the subway here. So I had to drive downtown, parked my car, was running through downtown Boston maybe about 10 o'clock, 10:30, something like that. And the city was already deserted. You could hear a pin drop. And I wound up getting over to Logan Airport by probably 11 or so in the morning. I mean, clearly by then, everything that was going to happen that day had already happened. But you get to Logan Airport, and it was also deserted, which I had never seen before in my life. And anybody who's been to a major U.S. airport, try imagining that major U.S. airport where it is empty. You could hear a pin drop. The only people who were there were families of victims of the flights who were slowly being guided to a crisis center at one of the hotels at the airport, and some media people who were kind of wandering around, not quite sure what to do. Eventually, they said, okay, all the media, you guys are going to go over to another hotel separate from the victims, and we're going to have a media briefing room there. We don't have anything to brief you on. Go hang out in that conference room until we do. And the memory that sticks to me the most was I was walking through the central parking facility of Logan Airport to get to that media holding area. And if you've ever been to Logan Airport, it is one central parking facility. It is enormous. Also, at that point, pretty much deserted. There were no people there. There was no traffic going in or out. But I was walking through, and I pressed the elevator button to go from whatever floor I was on down to the appropriate floor to get to my hotel destination. And at that moment, fighter jets flew overhead. And I knew they were fighter jets. We had already heard one or two fighter jets in Boston that morning. And I knew that there was no attack or anything that was going to happen in Boston. But still, you hear this ear-splitting sound of the fighter jets that had to be directly overhead of the airport. And I could not help but think this is what those people in the towers had to have heard just before the crash. And that realization, that is one of the few moments of my career that will stick with me, I'm sure, until the day I die. I will always remember the awareness that this is what they must have heard. I am not in any danger, but I can still feel my heart is starting to accelerate and the hair standing on the back of my neck and all of that. And I was having it easy, and I can't even fathom what must have gone through the heads of those people in the towers and at the Pentagon. The rest of the day I spent in that holding area where we pretty much watched TV and tried to get briefings from state police or the FBI or anybody else who would brief the media in Logan that day. There was probably about 60 or 70 of us. And I had my girlfriend who I was living with. She was from New Jersey, and she had several friends who were from New York. And so we spent the day kind of playing phone tag back and forth, either with each other or some of our friends who were from New York City, trying to figure out if they were in the towers or not. And thankfully, none of them were. And occasionally I would still play phone tag with my friend from the New York Daily News, who is an outstanding reporter. And he snuck into Ground Zero by about 4 p.m. that day. And he also said that was the most haunting thing. It gave him nightmares for weeks on end. And he basically said all he saw were bodies without heads and heads without bodies. He was there for, I think, about 8 or 9 hours before he finally got chased away. So I have a very vivid memory of that whole day and everything that happened, and the surrealness of walking through a major U.S. city that already was pretty much on lockdown. And even if they hadn't ordered everything closed, everybody either went home or was staring at a TV somewhere. The bars were actually full because everybody was in the bars watching TV because we didn't have smartphones with our TVs back then. You would ask what this means for me professionally, Tom, too. Again, because I'm in the media, it's a bit different that to a certain extent, I had some good economic fortunes from this event, which I feel terrible about that there was luck, both good and bad, that spiraled out from this event. And I had good luck that there were several major news outlets that didn't have anybody in Boston. They called me up. Can you help us out? Go to Logan Airport. I was there every day for, I think, about a week, just watching what was going on and talking to people as we started to fly around again as a country. And after that, there were lots of other things that happened in Boston, and I wound up working there for years with these outlets that basically were caught unprepared because nobody ever stopped to think we're going to have a major terrorist attack that's going to start in Boston. So maybe we need a Boston bureau just in case something else happens. And that changed their tune. And I am struck that for at least a period, people were much more supportive of the media. And I experienced that in a tiny way, but I have also talked with friends who have worked in, say, CNN or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, people who work at big major outlets. When we talk about the media, talking about those friends and acquaintances I have, they also said that people were much more appreciative of what the media were trying to do for a period. And it's sad that we've lost that because now fully, 40% of the country hates the media, period. And the other 60% hate the media that the other 40% watch. We're a very media divided country that didn't quite exist that way 20 years ago. And then, look, over time, the consequences of 9/11, all of the laws that got passed, the Patriot Act, the enhanced enforcement of the FCPA and everything else that led to more vigorous corporate compliance programs. I mean, I had no idea my career would take me from all of what I was doing then to writing about corporate compliance several years later. But clearly the consequences and the government's response to 9/11 were also, they were career builders and profession builders for a ton of people, including all of us on this podcast and probably everybody listening. I don't know how I feel about that, that such a terrible thing happened that led to, like I said, the Patriot Act, enhanced enforcement of the FCPA and other laws that have come to pass that are all about anti-money laundering and anti-corruption. And those are good things. And I'm glad that we talk about them, and it's fascinating work. But I'm always aware that a lot of what we do today is rooted in that one terrible day that happened 20 years ago.
Jonathan Armstrong, you are our resident alien, i.e. non-American. And I can't think of a more appropriate topic to ask you for your reflections on, literally from your perspective in the United Kingdom, of not so much the UK's response, but your response. What were you feeling wherever you were on 9/11, and what changes literally wrought across the globe impacted you professionally in the legal profession in the United Kingdom? And once again, from your perspective, looking across the pond, what are your reminiscences now, some 20 years later, after the date of 9/11?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks to everyone for their moving contributions. I'm going to be honest with you. I was playing golf. I play golf about every 10 years. I'm not a good golfer. And I'd just done a project for a client, and one of their senior management said, "You've done a fantastic piece of work for us. I'd like you to come and play in our golf day as a reward. And I think you should have a day out on us." So I went to play golf, but the business managed travel for airlines. And so they had all their major airline clients were the other teams in the golf competition. And my first awareness of it is that there was a team from a major airline behind us, and they were always pressing us to move on and play the hole, and they vanished. And then we noticed that the team in front of us also vanished. They were both had pilots and crisis management people from two major airlines, and we didn't really think anything of it, if I'm being completely honest. And we got to about the 17th hole, and we had noticed that things like the refreshments had stopped, the buggy coming round with drinks. But we didn't think anything of that either. And then on the 17th hole, I think the 17th or 18th hole, somebody came on a buggy and just shouted at us to say that we didn't have to continue and we could stop, and there was no need to be brave, or some words like that. And we didn't really hear what she said. And we didn't, to be absolutely honest with you, we didn't think about it at all until we got back to the clubhouse, and there was one of the airline teams. They were out there, obviously, hitting the phones and stuff, and said, how could you guys play golf? And we thought it was something that we'd maybe done on the course. Maybe we'd been too slow on a hole or whatever. And then they told us what had happened, and obviously we were in shocked beyond belief. And then, of course, you then worry about. To be really honest with you, I worried about my client and their business and the people around us. And I can remember saying at a certain time that the most of the airline folks had been told to stay where they were. They'd been told not to move even by ground transportation. So the client then went into this mode of trying to accommodate different crisis rooms around the hotel. And I said, look, and then they were trying to hit the phones to buy up hotel rooms for displaced air crew, because by then, of course, flights had stopped, certainly over US airspace. And and being told that, what experience had I got of booking hotels? I think they, and I said, well, I've only booked hotels for myself, and have you ever tried to buy 100 rooms at once? Well, no, I haven't. So they said, look, thanks for the offer, but we don't really need you. And I said, look, I'll make coffee, I'll make tea. You just say what you need. And then they came back to me about half an hour later and said, look, there's a number of people here who, we've been walked around the room. A lot of people here would like today to be, sort of as normal, to take their mind off it. They still need to be fed. So we're going to go ahead with the prize dinner for the golf. And will you host it? And then the guys that were meant to host it, they can go and buy the hotel rooms, buy everyone's accommodation, because they know what they're doing. And so I ended up bizarrely hosting a golf dinner where I suspect almost nobody wanted to be there, and then had the very surreal experience of then having to award myself a prize because nobody else had completed the course, obviously. So our team had won. And we kept trying to refuse the prize and weren't allowed to. And it was a completely surreal experience. And if I'm being really honest with you, at times I've almost felt ashamed about that. And I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure what I could have done in that environment. But it was certainly obviously trivial to what other people went through, wholly trivial. But one of the things that was my immediate concern, I think, is, again, being really, really honest with you, how's Bush going to cope? Bush was, as I recall, a relatively new president. Clinton, I think, had, to my minds at least, been perhaps more war statesman-like, if that is the word, more of a dependable commander-in-chief, maybe, to my eyes. Maybe that's a sense of distance. And I was worried about Bush, and I was worried about some sort of knee-jerk reaction. Of course, we'd experienced U.S. missions that perhaps weren't appropriately targeted, landing in Iran when they should have been in Iraq, etc., etc. And I think from a UK perspective, we were really rather worried about that. And I just watched the BBC Apple joint documentary, where absolutely fascinating, looking at the president's war room at the time and interviews with Bush. And I have to say, I think I was wrong. I mean, one of the lessons I think we had of 9/11 is, at a more mundane level, the need for crisis planning. And I think we've all got better at crisis planning since. Things like cloud computing, of course, didn't exist on 9/11. The internet was centered around 9 major servers, all of which were in the Beltway, all of which were, close to the Pentagon. And we realized that the effects of attacks like that could be hugely consequential. If the entire internet is routed through cables that pass underneath the Pentagon, then we have to think about what we do. So, of course, some of the servers moved almost immediately to Switzerland to give more resiliency to world communications. And then at a micro level, businesses started to look at that as well, and look at disaster recovery centers, look at backups. And obviously that's really the origin of cloud computing. And we also looked, I think, more at crisis management as a profession as well, I think, after 9/11. And just reflecting on Bush's interview, I think he said 2 really important things that I've always thought that are really words to watch out for in a crisis. First of all, he said, quote, "In a time of crisis, you've got to say something." And some of you have heard me say this about Winston Churchill, said exactly the same, about how a vacuum gets filled, and it gets filled by truth or it gets filled by lies. And I think Bush was correct but brave in almost speaking to the American people immediately to say, we don't know what this is, but we're going to find out. And I think he had quite a calm and measured response versus what I thought might be the case. And he explained that himself. He said, again quoting, "You can't make rational decisions when you're angry." And we see a lot of that, in my day-to-day practice, in things like ransomware, where businesses tend to make bad decisions in the heat of the moment when they're angry. So I think it had, that was one of the consequences. As far as personal consequences were concerned, I was due to speak at Georgetown University not long after 9/11 in early November. And it was something that I wanted to do. Obviously, I had grown up with terrorism, with the IRA. When I was 12, 13, 14, I think, was in what was a suspected IRA attack in the centre of London. It turned out not to be that. It turned out to be a gas main explosion. So I think those of people of my generation in the UK had grown up with terrorism. We'd been to Harrods the day before it was blown up. And like or loathe Margaret Thatcher, we always had the words of Margaret Thatcher, you do not give in to terrorism. You do not negotiate with terrorists. You do not give in to them. You do not let them alter your way of life. And so I was determined still to go to the US if I could, and my firm prohibited me from going. And then about 10 days before, they said, okay, you can go. You wanted to go, you can go. We can get you insured now. Off you go. And I can remember coming home, and my daughters were very little then, saying to my wife, look, I'm really quite conflicted now. I've sort of said I should go, and they've said you can go. So Judith said, okay, we'll all go. We'll take the kids as well. And it was an amazing trip. As Jonathan was saying, even in, I guess, late October, early November, DC was still deserted. And I'll just give you one story. When I was lecturing at Georgetown, my wife went to the zoo with the girls, and she couldn't find anybody to speak to about transportation. And she went up to this guy, who she later found out was a bus driver, but he had a sort of uniform on. She thought he was one of the zoo people, and said, can you tell me the quickest way to get back to the center of DC? And he said, come with me. And he put her on a tourist coach and drove her back to the hotel. And she said, look, I only wanted to know how to do it. And he said, if you're prepared to come over to our country in our time of need, the least I can do is drive you back to your hotel. And he wouldn't take any cash, and Judith hid money in the coach because he wouldn't take cash. And not only that, he let the girls sit up front, and he did his full tourist commentary for free, driving them back to the hotel. And we had some very wonderful and touching moments like that on that trip. And I think, just as we were saying earlier, I think 9/11 showed the worst of people, but also the best of people, I think, as well. And I think it did give us pause for reflection. It does give us pause for reflection to recognize, all those brave people who did step up to the plate and responded and were prepared to stamp out the evil of terrorism. And I just pick up just two other quick things as well. I mean, obviously, I think from a UK perspective, I don't wish this to sound Little Ireland at all. Forgive me if it does. But I think it made other parts of the world recognize the true evils of terror as well. So there was not only attacks on US soil, but in Spain and in France and in the Middle East and in Egypt. And we were all touched by these horrendous terrorism attacks. But I think it also made the world more united. As Jonathan said, we've had, new laws against terror funding. And that's something that the world did not take seriously. From a UK perspective, we know that attacks on UK soil were funded by money that came out of America that the US authorities didn't have an appetite to do anything about. And this attack, was horrendous, but it did make us focus on the evil that is terrorism and act as one rather than be disjointed and to allow terrorism to win.
Gentlemen, I wanted to thank you all. Those were very poignant remarks. We are going to end, as always, with shout outs and rants. My guess is that it's going to be much more somber than normal. And I'm going to join at the end as well. So we'll take the same order. Mike Volkov, Jay Rosen, Jonathan Marks, Matt Kelly, and Jonathan Armstrong. Mike, do you have a shout out or rant for us today?
Well, my shout out is more towards, based on my comments earlier on the soldiers who were killed in Afghanistan. I mean, some of the pictures and some of the life stories are just heart-wrenching. And when you see there's, one soldier carrying, holding a baby, or another soldier, helping somebody else to get across, to the airport. I mean, it's incredible to me. And, the images from the whole withdrawal were just gut-wrenching. And, it reminds us, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like, the tail end of our 9/11 story was, the final pullout out of Afghanistan. Even though, many have argued that we accomplished, our mission, 10 years in when Osama bin Laden was killed. But it just was just a heartfelt and appreciative moment to, people from the military and the people that we lost, because it certainly was a tragic loss.
Jay Rosen.
A shout out to a couple lost commodities, civility and unity. These are things that have always brought our country together. And bookended by what Mike just discussed with the pullout from Afghanistan and with the remembrances of 20 years ago today, this 1 hour that we've been speaking together, I feel there's been a lot of civility and unity, and maybe we can start something here today, and that could flow out to our other citizens of the world and the country. So those are my somber thoughts. Tom, thanks for giving us the opportunity to remember and share today.
Jonathan Marks.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to shout out about related to 9/11, but I'm going to focus in on a couple. The first responders, the firefighters, the police officers, the nurses, the doctors, everyone who was there that day, everyone who continues to take care of people that are suffering from post-traumatic stress. Thank you for your service. Thank you to our military for all they do. I just, we all say thank you sometimes when we see a man or a woman in uniform, or, we see a firefighter or police officer, but I don't know that we can really appreciate until we walk in their shoes. And so, again, just my deepest gratitude to all those that help protect and serve our great nation.
Matt Kelly.
Yeah, well, I have struggled with what I had wanted to rant about this month, frankly, because there's so many different options. And while I certainly see the compelling need to dwell on 9/11 and think about some of the lessons there, there's still so much that is going wrong with this country at the moment. And I could rant about the Texas legislature and that anti-abortion law that they passed. I could rant about the Supreme Court, which did not intervene to halt that law, which was a preposterous and offensive thing that the Supreme Court did, because they know full well that this law contradicts a ruling the court just made on almost the exact same point about legislatures creating a right of action among third parties to intercede and file a civil suit against others. The Supreme Court just said, Congress, you can't do that. And now they're punting in the middle of the night, not taking any action on this Texas law, which is essentially outlawed abortion. I could rant about them. I could rant about the military officials I have seen who have been denouncing the evacuation from Afghanistan, including one lieutenant colonel who I am sure is going to turn up on Fox News fairly soon as a quote-unquote military analyst, and he was famous for saying, we, the military, need to start telling they, I guess that's the civilian control of the military, what is going on and what has to happen. So here we have members of the military who are unhappy with civilian government, who are talking about how they should wrestle away control from the civilians. Thankfully, that lieutenant colonel has been fired and relieved of command, and I'm hoping he's going to face a course-martial sometime soon. I could go on all day long about so much that is happening in this country right now that deserves a rant. And I've been struggling with it, and I think really listening to everybody else here, I just really want to rant more about what I will call the backsliders in this country right now, who very clearly are running away from what America stands for. And that includes Republicans in Texas. It includes the 5 justices in the Supreme Court. It includes that idiot lieutenant colonel who hopefully will wind up facing severe penalties for what he has said and done against his chain of command, and all of the anti-vaxxers and everybody else out there. We have too many people in this country who are walking away from what America stands for, which is freedom, tolerance, respect of the rule of law, and trying to find a consensus with everybody else. And they're just going for raw exercise of power. And that's that. And what the hell, people? The only other ones who would really appreciate raw exercise of power to force their beliefs down the throats of a majority that doesn't want it, the ones who would most appreciate that would be the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who killed 3,000 Americans 20 years ago and who just blew up 13 more of them in Kabul last week. If you really believe that sort of future for America is what you want, do the rest of us a favor and go over to Afghanistan and go live over there, because those are the religious zealots who reject democracy and the rule of law, and you would fit in just fine with them, but you would not fit in with America here, and you dishonor everybody who died on 9/11 and every other person who has died in Afghanistan since then, trying to keep this country safe. So to all the backsliders, you are the ones I am ranting about, and you deserve every bit of opprobrium we can muster and throw at you.
Jonathan Armstrong.
Well, thanks, Tom. I think on the last podcast, my shout out was to those who run towards danger, not away from it. And I probably want to repeat the same theme. And Jonathan has eloquently called out the first responders. I guess I'd also say those passengers of UA-93 who wrestled the terrorists down. But I just want to reflect on the events of 7/7. Of course, the UK had a much smaller terrorist attack though on that day, and particularly to Dr. Peter Holden, a man whose story isn't told enough, in my view. So what happened on 7/7 was the tube was bombed and people diverted to buses instead to get away from the area. But there was a suicide bomber on one of the buses, and it was packed with people who'd come off the tube lines, and the bus was diverted. But by strange happenstance, the bus diversion meant that the explosion took place outside the British Medical Association building. And in the British Medical Association was Dr. Peter Holden, who was one of the few doctors qualified as a Gold Commander incident responder. And again, by happenstance, there was a conference going on in the BMA headquarters. The BMA is the centre of the medical profession in the UK. And there were, as one doctor said, more doctors than you could ever find in any casualty department. So some of the most talented emergency doctors were in the building when the bus blew up outside. But they didn't have any equipment at all. So they took the tables out of the cafe and they used them as stretchers. They used the courtyard of the BMA building, a beautiful historic building, as an emergency hospital. And staff and doctors at the BMA used their own clothing and the napkins and tablecloths from the restaurant as bandages. And they behaved like true heroes. They'd gone for a meeting on emergency medicine, and they ended up saving tens of lives, maybe hundreds of lives, by running out into the street and using what they could find to rescue people. So, again, my shout out, sorry to be repetitive, is to people like Dr. Peter Holden, who put others first in a time of crisis.
This week I did a podcast series called Looking Back on 9/11, and my last interview was a gentleman named John Lee Dumas. In the fall of 9/11, John Lee Dumas was a college senior, and he was an ROTC. And he told me on his podcast that when he saw the second plane hit the towers, he knew he was going to war. When I asked him for his reminiscences of 20 years ago, he looked off and he goes, "Oh my God, that was 20 years ago." He's 41 now. He went to war when he was 21. Lieutenant in the U.S. Army, just graduated from college. And I think we lose sight of not simply the veterans, the men who go to war for us, but they're in their 20s. They're 18. My father went to World War II when he was 20 into combat. None of us are in our 20s. None of us are, in our 40s. And we forget that it's the young men and now young women who fight these wars. So I want to shout out to the 21-year-olds and the 18-year-olds, because John Dumas ended his podcast with, "We are the home of the free because of the brave." And that's what I want to shout out to, those brave 21-year-olds, those brave 18-year-olds who went to war 20 years ago. And here we are now. Well, gentlemen, this has probably been certainly the most poignant Everything Compliance we've done. For me, probably, no, it is the most moving. I wanted to thank everyone. I heard some very heartfelt stories today. So thank you again. And I hope all of our listeners will maybe have a moment of silence on 9/11 and think about where America is today and what that day may have meant to you. Thanks, guys, and I look forward to getting back together. Thank you for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance. I hope you will check out my 6-part podcast series, Looking Back on 9/11, where I talk to 6 people who talk about where they were on 9/11, the impact of 9/11 on them and our profession of compliance, and look back with some reflection at the 20 years since the attack on America. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join us again.